Welcome everybody to the One Journey Symposium as part of the 230th year anniversary since the 1,196 souls made the journey from Nova Scotia to the shores of Sierra Leone to establish Freetown. Myself and Mr Gaba, we made the journey to across the Atlantic Ocean, but this time in Boeing 737 to be part of the mayor's one-week festival. It's been lovely. It's quite amazing what could be done when everyone heeds the mayor's call. It's been one that was of inclusion, and her message at the start of the preparation for this festival was very clear. She wanted everyone in the city from east to west to draw on the strength of the Nova Scotian settlers who founded the Freetown and all others who came after, because she believed Freetown was a place for new beginnings, and there's been a lot of new beginnings since they arrived. She wanted the recent events to do with the Civil War, in which folks had to start again in Freetown, the health crisis that forced people to start again in Freetown, and some of the disasters like the mudslide and the Wellington fire all got people in many ways starting. And in between this recent one and the very first since the founding, there's been a lot of new beginnings to what we have. And it's that spirit of inclusion that it was felt at yesterday's parade through the cities. If you have an opportunity, look at that video. You have a link from Historic Freetown. The message was clear. We're hoping that through this symposium, where we try to make another connecting point to communities both in Freetown and in the US, the Carolinas, all the way up to in the Caribbean and in Canada. We make these connections so that we all appreciate the concept that this has been one journey in which a set of people through difficult circumstances have found new meaning, have found new beginnings in these different communities. They were uprooted several times, but they finally established what they were looking for, and that's embodied in the city of Freetown. So welcome everybody to this One Journey Symposium. It's a series that's going to go on for the duration of the year. There will be on other important days, like when the Black Folk came and the Maroons, etc., there will be another symposium. And you can get all that information through the historicfreetown.com. So without further ado, I'm going to just give a quick overview of what to expect. The program logic was we wanted to tell the story before of what it was before the communities in Africa were like about, before it was interrupted by the slave trade, the process, the different dynamics this enslavement caused in the Americas and the Caribbeans for people of African descent, the community struggles that they went through, and their effort as part of the Fellowship of Free during the American Civil War, where every party was looking for some sort of freedom, and the eventual repatriation to Canada, and the disappointment they got in Canada that allowed the heroic members like Thomas Peters and others to brave the seas and find a solution that led to 15 ships sailing from January of 1792, arriving here in March 11, 1792. So today is the eve of that journey. The 15 ships were in the Sierra Leone harbor, and I will give you guys, I'll give you guys a feel of that particular view of what it is at this moment from the mayor's office. This was where the ships, all 15 ships, anchored, and on that eve, those folks must have been thinking what the journey, reflecting on the journey they've been. And we're hoping through the panels and the presentations, we'll all appreciate those reflections and what they drew from it. But this was where they were anchored, if you could see. Thank you very much. Without further ado, we will move to the first event, which will be a panel discussion by historians. We have historians who are from Sierra Leone, and they have had careers that has got them to reflect on the legacy and of the stories and legacy of the first settlers and even others thereafter. And it will be moderated by Dr. Sylvia Macaulay King, and she will do a short bio of the different panelists, and she will give them their instructions. Without further ado, Dr. Sylvia Macaulay King.
Good morning and good afternoon, depending on what part of the globe you are joining us from. As the host said, I am Sylvia Macaulay King, a professor of history at California State University in California, where it is still very early in the morning, but I'm still pleased to be joining you all at this time. Let me start by extending hearty congratulations to Her Worship the Mayor, Yvonne Akisoya, and all the councilors at the City Council on this historic milestone, keeping the city moving forward in spite of all the setbacks from time to time. It is indeed important to stop and reflect. And that is what will happen in this first panel on the One Journey Symposium, this panel of historians and others who are interested in the history of the city. This panel has been broadly titled Lives in West African Communities Before the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And our speakers, we have about 4 speakers who have been invited to share their perspectives on this journey from their various vantage points. And so I will introduce them and call on them in the order in which they are listed in the program. And they have been asked to speak for about 10 minutes so that we will have some time at the end to entertain questions from the audience. And speaking of questions, at this time, I will ask members in the audience to record their questions in the chat, and we will get to those questions at the end of all the presentations. So without further ado, I will now introduce the first speaker, my good friend, Professor Ismail Rashid, a fellow comrade, historian, Professor Rashid grew up in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and has been teaching at Vassar College since 1998. He received his BA honors in classics and history from the University of Ghana, master's in race relations from Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and his PhD in African history from McGill University. His research interests include subaltern resistance against colonialism, public health, and conflicts and security in contemporary Africa. And so I invite Professor Rashid to give his 10 minutes of reflections.
Thank you very much, Professor Sylvia. Macaulay, I realized the emphasis was on 10 minutes. What I'm going to do very quickly is to join you and to join also my good friend, Adrian, in thanking the mayor, the organizing committee, and all those who put their energies into organizing the series of events to commemorate the arrival of Africans from different parts of the United States via Nova Scotia to Freetown. I know we know them in our history of Sierra Leone as the Nova Scotian, but for many of them, their stay in Nova Scotia was fairly brief, 4 or 5 years. And some of them were people who would never have considered themselves Nova Scotians because they joined the ships from the United States to Sierra Leone. Just what I want to do today really is to give just fairly 3 broad sets of remarks as a way of joining the conversation. So when I saw the topic, West Africa before the Atlantic slavery, I said, no, they can't be asking us to do this because I teach an entire course, and I'm sure many of my other colleagues teach entire courses on Africa before the Atlantic slave trade. This would have meant that we would have spent the morning going through the rise and fall of old Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Kanem-Borno, speak about Nok, the Hausa states. This is just mind-boggling. Thankfully, there are excellent volumes on the history of all of the states and people that I have mentioned that really I would enjoin those who are members of the audience and Sierra Leoneans and people in Freetown in particular to read. We need to be attuned to the history of not only our city, of our country, but also our continent. And I'll return to the theme of the history of a continent in a little while. But one of the things that I did was to go back to really the document, which is the seminal document that really mediates the experience of the people who came from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. A well-known book. I mean, in Canadian circles, the Canadians can't get enough of talking about the Book of Negroes, which is really a list of over 3,000 so-called Black loyalists, people of African descent who chose to fight for their freedom by abandoning the American revolutionaries who were talking about wonderful ideas of human liberty, of human freedom, but want to keep people of African descent enslaved. And the British made really an ambiguous proclamation vis-a-vis them. Come over and fight for our sides against these folks who want to keep you enslaved. And of course, the British lost the war. And the folks who were losers, who were known as the loyalists, went to British North Africa. By the way, it wasn't called Canada then. It was called British North America. So they went to British North America. And that big problem that I'm going to talk about in a minute kept following these people of African descent. Those who fought on the side of the British were promised land, they were promised freedom, and they were promised autonomy. They went to Canada and realized that working in a darker skin in the 18th century and even up to now is a sign of disadvantage. It's a sign of disadvantage. And we know the history, we know what happened subsequently that led these people to continuously petition the British, not only for land, for what they were due, but eventually for some of them, the ability to come back to Africa. So looking at the Book of Negro, really what I was trying to do was to see if I can find the roots and to see whether there was any information that would signal and connect these folks to back to the continent, keeping in mind that I wanted to think about where these folks might have come from different parts of really West Central Africa, where the majority of enslaved people came from. But the entry in the so-called Book of Negro was cursory. And again, to my surprise, the majority of people who were listed in the Book of Negro were said to have been people who were born at one particular point or the other in the United States. Of course, historians looking at that information are more or less sort of sorted out that some of that information might not be correct. So connecting them back to the continent, connecting them to the period before they arrived in Sierra Leone was challenging. And for us historians, well, especially for the younger ones, people who might be interested in history, what I want to point out is that there's a whole lot of work that could be done in that area in terms of research. So there is necessarily a disconnect between these people who are clearly African, of African descent, their experience in the United States, going through Canada and their return to Sierra Leone. So they are of Africa in a particular sense, but they're also not of Africa in another sense. And I'm going to come to that. The second set of remarks is on a panel like this, there are a number of things that I want us to think about as we commemorate and think about the 230th anniversary of Freetown and the history of the people who have come to identify themselves as descendants of not only the Nova Scotians, the liberated Africans, the Blacks from the UK who came earlier as Creole. We have to be careful between that tension between the history of people self-identified as Creole and the history of the city of Freetown. Yesterday's March Past, cultural March Past, was fascinating because it showed what the city is at this particular point in time and how it had evolved through its 200-year history. I really want to caution us to think about that carefully, because Adrian, my good friend, you started off with saying that we want this to be an inclusive moment for Freetown. The second is we must be aware and we must balance the tension between history and heritage. Between history and heritage. History is much more complicated, it's much more messier, it's much more contentious. And I like one of your slogans on the 230th anniversary, which says Freetown, many stories, and therefore many interpretations. From its inception, from that moment of the finding of that new settlement by the people that came from Canada, it was a contentious settlement. It was a contentious settlement. The meaning of what Freetown was and what it was to become was never settled. It was never settled. It was never settled. And I'll come and talk about that on a third point. And that third point sends me back to the scholarship that exists here about Freetown and about Sierra Leone that are written by different sets of people, both people that are identified as Creole and non-Creole. It's fascinating. And some of them have been our professors. I mean, Afro Porter, Kintola Wise, Mark Bailey File, Frances Wise, Philomena Steady, and one of our colleagues, Joseph Bangua, have all written histories which shows that Freetown is a place of contentious and multiple narratives. I don't have time, and in the Q&A, we can go into what those contentious narratives look like, and how they shape the kind of vibrant Freetown that we in. I'm going to end up with a final set of remarks, and this is partly because this is where I'm most comfortable to speak from in terms of my experience. As first, a colleague of mine was sort of exchanging this morning, and I said, look, as somebody who identifies first as Black, African, Sierra Leonean, Freetonian, and Ako, what does Freetown mean to me in terms of not only as a professional historian, my experiences and thinking about what there are a number of things, and also politically, I have never hidden my colors here. I am a Pan-Africanist. I believe that my experience predisposes me to be a Pan-Africanist, somebody who considers themselves first and foremost, not only citizen of all of those identities that I have said, but that being a Black person from Africa positions you to be in the world in a certain place. So what are the meanings of Freetown to me, and how do I think those should inform folks in Sierra Leone? I know I have a few minutes. I'm going to round up very quickly. So first, for me, Freetown means a place that is unabashedly Pan-Africanist in its outlook. I started with the Book of Negroes because the people who came here came from Africa, different parts of Africa, and they came to reconstitute new ways of being Africa. Second, Freetown for me means cosmopolitanism. It's interesting because we're like fish in water. Many of us do not understand how big the history of Freetown is. The history of Freetown is not the history of a small group of people. The history of Freetown is a very cosmopolitan, a very international history, which does not only include all of these people that I'm saying, but also the circularity and movement of people. Again, in Q&A, we can talk about that. The last 2 points that I'm going to end up with in terms of what Freetown means to me is Freetown means a particular kind of modernity, a 19th century kind of Atlantic and African modernity. The creativity, the creative spirit that not only the Nova Scotians, the liberated Africans, the so-called Black poor came with, the Maroons came with, but also the other people who we now share the space Freetown and Sierra Leone with, that is Timney, Limbad, the people who were in the march past yesterday, became intertwined to create an ever-reproducing culture that's very cosmopolitan in character. I wish we can underline that. Final point is Freetown means to me a particular kind of freedom. I don't think there's any place in Africa, that can signal that modernity, that sense of being free in a new way, in a world that has been shaped, turned over, and thrown into turmoil by slavery and anti-slavery than Freetown. I'll end there. I know that we would have time for Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Rashid. You have started us off with a lot of food for thought. As such, I want to remind members of the audience that we are accepting your questions for the panelists. Please submit those questions via chat, and we will get to them after all the presentations have been made. So then let me introduce another friend and colleague, Professor Nemata Blyden, who is a professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She holds a BA in history and international relations from Mount Holyoke College and an MPhil and PhD from Yale University. Dr. Blyden specializes in African and African diaspora history. She is the author of many books, most recent of which is she co-authored Between Africa and America, Recalibrating Black Americans' Relationship to the Diaspora with Dr. Jeanette Eileen Jones. And her most recent book, published in 2019, African Americans and Africa, A New History, published by Yale University Press, provides an introduction to the relationship between African Americans and the African continent from the era of slavery to the present, examining the diversity of African American identities through relationships with region, ethnicity, immigration, and slavery to investigate a fundamental area of African American studies. And so, without further ado, I introduce to you my friend and colleague, Dr. Nemata Blyden.
Thank you, Dr. Macaulay. And thank you to the mayor and the committee for having me, particularly to B. Morgan and Adrian for all the logistical work that they've done for this. Like Dr. Rashid, I was stumped by the request to talk about such a broad topic. And so obviously I'm not going to, but you know, I thought I would just sort of do a sort of a general and then perhaps support some of what Dr. Rashid was saying. When we teach our students about West Africa before the slave trade, a daunting task, we talk first and foremost about the diversity of African communities before the period of the slave trade. As we try to get our students to understand this history, right? There's so many things that we can focus on. The kingdoms, right? That Dr. Rashid referred to, ancient Ghana, ancient Mali, you know, Kanem-Bornu, the Kingdom of Congo, all these many polities, the stateless societies, right, that existed in West African communities, communities that govern themselves in different ways. I'm currently teaching a class on women in African history. We can talk about the experiences and the lives of African women before the slave trade, what their lives were like. Oh, I should be looking at my time. What their lives were before the slave trade took so many millions of them away. What were their cultural practices, their religions, right? Their food traditions, or we can talk about it specific to Sierra Leone, the communities that were in Sierra Leone, or we could talk about it in general. What were those traditions, those cultural practices that existed in African societies before the slave trade? On the American side, and you heard that I'm a scholar of the diaspora, on the American side, and you'll hear this later as we examine those connections, right? We look at what the cultural retentions and the legacies of Africans who were brought to the Americas were, right? What did Africans bring with them? So understanding these societies before the slave trade can tell us something about what Africans brought to the Americas for so many years. Scholars studying African-American history, scholars studying the history of Africans in the diaspora, talked of them as people who came as blank slates, as people who came with no history, as people who came with no culture, right? But as one historian has said, Dr. Michael Gomez, Africans who were brought to America, or to the Americas, had lived, he says, as members of specific societies in Africa, so that although their lives were altered by enslavement, they continue to be informed by both the African antecedent and by the unique combinations of their distinctive backgrounds in the various locales of the Americas. Their cultural and social provenance, he says, became critical to grasping the totality of their sojourn and its relation to corresponding experiences elsewhere. That is, the Africans who ended up in the Americas didn't leave their homelands behind in their memories. They may have been physically wrenched from Sierra Leone, Ghana, what is today Ghana, what is Nigeria, what is today Angola. They may have been physically wrenched from those places, but their memories of those places remained. Their cultural practice, in their cultural practices, in the way they raised their children, in their naming practices. Right? Scholars in the Americas today studying African cultural retentions talk about the ways in which Africans under slavery in the diaspora managed to though given names by their captors, given names by those who enslaved them, managed to hold on to their names, managed to hold on to elements of those practices and pass those names down to their children, pass those traditions, those cultural practices down to their children. And this is why today we can talk about the Nova Scotians. And again, I want to sort of reinforce what Dr. Rashid said about the label of Nova Scotians. I mean, it's sort of an easy way to talk about this group of people, but important to remember that these were enslaved Africans from the United States, largely. These people who I'm talking about, who came with elements of Africa with them, that they took to Nova Scotia and then took back to Sierra Leone. And so we can talk about them today. These were men and women who had fought to return, right? Perhaps they didn't hope to return to Sierra Leone. Perhaps they hoped to return to the very spaces from which they had been taken. Remember that some of these men and women may have been born, may have been African born, right? Been born in Yoruba land, been born in somewhere else on the west coast of Africa, or west central coast of Africa. So these were people who had a desire to go home, right? But they ended up in Sierra Leone, and that became their home, right? And so we celebrate them today. And this, of course, this experience has shaped their descendants. It shaped how they adjusted to their time in Sierra Leone. It shaped how they dealt with the British colonial administration that could complain about Nova Scotians, that these people have come with these sensibilities of liberty and equality and freedom, which of course were tenets that they had learned in their experiences in the United States, right? So when the Nova Scotians asked for their rights, when they asked to be given what they had been promised in Nova Scotia, they ran into conflict with the British, who saw them as demanding, right? Demanding too much. This is what they brought back, right? And this is what they took back with them. This is the Pan-African sensibility that Dr. Rashid talks about, that they brought with them to create this new society in the colony of Freetown, this very diverse colony in the colony of Freetown. Later on, I'll be talking about the influence of African Americans and West Indians in the colony, but I want to read a little bit of how I started my first book on West Indians in Africa that illustrates the diversity of the population to which, in Freetown in the early 19th century, to which the Nova Scotians were foundational. And this is a quote from an article in the Sierra Leone Royal Gazette in April of 1818, so about 10 years after Freetown, Sierra Leone becomes a crown colony. And the Sierra Leone Gazette reported in this article an opening fair in the colony of Freetown. So something akin to maybe what happened yesterday in terms of the parade. And the article mentions that the mayor, unfortunately, it wasn't a female mayor at that time, obviously it was a man, but the mayor led the procession, followed by the worshipful Alderman Carew and the other magistrates, attended by the principal inhabitants and a numerous mixed crowd of all descriptions, white and black, male and female, soldiers, seamen, mandingos, fullers, timonies, bullums, crewmen, etc. At that time, the mayor of the colony was a European, right? The alderman mentioned, Thomas Carew, was a Black West Indian. And the various magistrates and principal inhabitants were probably a mix of Black and white settlers, leading merchants, and the like. But I leave you with this, again, to buttress what Dr. Rashid said, to talk about the ways in which this procession, characterized by its diversity, was typical of the small settlement of Freetown throughout the 19th century, which right from the beginning boasted this kind of diverse population. We're talking about the Nova Scotians now, we'll talk about the Maroons, we'll talk about these African Americans and West Indians who came, as well as the indigenous populations that come to make Freetown this multicultural space that Professor Rashid talked about. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Blyden, for adding to that, to the conversation. Let me go ahead and introduce Mr. Gaba. Mr. Gaba is a professional structural engineer based in Freetown. He's currently the director of building for Gideon GRC Consulting, a Black-owned multidisciplinary consulting and construction management firm. Mr. Gaba was raised in Freetown and attended the Prince of Wales School, as well as Frobisher College, before proceeding to the UK to complete his undergraduate degree. He obtained a BSc honors degree in civil engineering and math in 1981, and a master's degree in construction engineering from Leeds University. Mr. Gaba is a fellow of the Institution of Structural Engineers, UK, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the Sierra Leone Institute of Engineers. He's a proud member of the Creole Descendants Union and is actively involved in efforts by the organization to build a museum and cultural center in Freetown. He's a member and former chair of the board of the National Organization of Sierra Leoneans in North America, NOSLINA, and a member of the Sierra Leone Community of New Jersey organization. He's also part of the editorial staff for the Journal of Sierra Leone Studies. Mr. Gaba is a former chair of the Bunce Island Coalition and was actively involved in the preservation and stabilization of the Bunce Island slave castle and an advocate for raising the awareness of preserving Sierra Leone's historic sites and artifacts. Welcome, Mr. Gaba.
Thank you very much. And I'm here with Adrian here in Freetown to celebrate Freetown at 230 years. I do feel a little, I don't want to say inadequate, but being among these historians, these professional historians is a bit daunting for me. History has sort of become a passion of mine. As you read from my resume, I am more of a structural engineer, so I've been more a technologist than a historian, but I have become very fascinated with the history of Sierra Leone and really also the Sierra Leone-American connection and the slave trading era between the mid-1750s and mid-1850s. So I'm just going to almost reprise some of what I spoke about a little earlier this week. And I hope it will give some people additional information about, you know, the early Freetown years, the early settlement. So what I want to say is, you know, not a lot of history has been written about the Sierra Leone region prior to, you know, the Black Poor and the Nova Scotian settlers coming in. But what we do know is that the first Europeans, the Portuguese, started to visit this region of West Africa in the 1460s. And it soon became known as a great watering hole where sailors would come to get fresh water and to get salt to preserve their food. John Hawkins, who was a well-known British sailor and the first to enslave or capture enslaved Africans from the Sierra Leone region, did not specifically you know, stop. It's not known if he specifically stopped in what is called the watering hole, which is where Freetown now is, on his voyage to this area. But it was said that he did come and get water from a watering hole. So, you know, so that's one of the early you know, comments or historical things about John Hawkins or about Sierra Leone. This area, which has become the watering hole, was called King Jimmy, and obviously because of the chief who was there called King Jimmy. One of the things we do know is that the Dutch navigator de Ruyter did come to the region in 1664, and after he sacked the slave fort at Tasso Island, came down to this watering hole in King Jimmy. And as we all know, well, as many Sierra Leoneans know, he did engrave, they left some writing on a piece of stone, a slab of stone, and it's buried in the King Jimmy, the area called King Jimmy in Freetown. Anyway, moving on, before Freetown came into existence in 1792, we know that there was also a place called Granville Town. This is where the Black Poor, who actually came from England in 1787, settled. The Black Poor were also, enslaved Africans who many had escaped slavery to fight with the British, and rather than going to Nova Scotia, ended up going to England. But the British were were not too keen on having so many poor Black people in England, and so they came up upon this idea of obviously, sending some of them back to Africa. So the Black Poor came to Sierra Leone in 1787. And before that, the town there was called Malong, or that is what history books say it was. Malong was a name that the Temne people gave to this region that now became Freetown. And one of the things that I always try to point out is that the Temne people who lived in this area had only settled in this same region probably about 200 years prior to 1787. So they came in the 1500s. The name Malong is supposedly translated to be the place of the whalers, and it's the place where men and women wept in the storm. And this was in reference to the fact that during the rainy season, the rainy season was very ferocious, and because of a lot of the mosquitoes and diseases, a lot of lives were claimed, especially from a lot of the young children. I also think, for one of the other names that early Sierra Leone was called was the white man's grave, and this was specifically because of the malaria that ransacked a lot of these areas. But also in this area, during the early settlements, the whole of the western area was really mangrove swamp, and with sharks and crocodiles in the shallows. And so, especially when it flooded, you ended up people being attacked by this, and that is why this name Malong was given to this area. So so this was an area where these early settlers initially from Britain, and then of course the Nova Scotian settlers, as we call them, we all know that they are, enslaved Africans who fought with the British. And I wouldn't delve more into that. But one of the things I think I would like to point out is that one of the reasons why this area was suddenly preferred by the British to come and resettle all these free Blacks, and it can be laid squarely at the feet of a British botanist called Henry Smithman, who had lived on Banana Island and became known as Mr. Termite. He actually ended up being married to King Tom, who was one of the kings of the region. He got married to his daughter, and the daughter unfortunately passed away by the time he finished doing his investigation in the region. And one of the things he did when he went back was to produce what was called the plan of a settlement to be made near Sierra Leone on the Grain Coast of Africa. And he significantly embellished the welcome and the fertile lands that these Black Poor would encounter once they got here. When they got here, they found it was totally different from what had been expected. And there are instances of, one or two of them writing back to the British philanthropists and complaining about how horrendous the site was. I will just close off with one of the comments from one of the Black poor, person called Abraham Elliot Griffith, who was educated by Granville Sharp in England. And he wrote this to Granville Sharp upon arrival in Granville town. Honored sir, I am sorry and very sorry indeed to inform you, dear sir, that this country does not agree with us at all. And without a very sudden change, I do not think there will be one of us left at the end of 12 months. Neither can the people be brought to any rule or regulation. They're very obstinate in their tempers. It was really a very great pity that we ever came to this country after the death of Mr. Smithman, for we are settled upon the very worst part. There is not a thing put in the ground that will grow more than a foot. Quite a plague seems to reign here among us, and I have been dangerously ill myself. But it pleased the Almighty to restore me to health again, and first opportunity I have, I shall embark for the West Indies. So he was just telling it like it is, saying that this area was really horrible. About the 424 of them came, landed in Sierra Leone in 1787. Within a year, that number had reduced to about 70. So, you know, what I always call the British experiment to resettle Blacks would, if you know, the Nova Scotian settlers hadn't come, probably would have failed as an experiment, which the British had done. But the Nova Scotians came, and there were more resilient group of people. And, you know, Freetown is what it is today because a lot of these Nova Scotians came and settled and were a hardier bunch. And, you know, then they were joined by, obviously, a lot of the other folks, the Maroons, the liberated Africans, who many people may not know, but were so much significant in number. The Nova Scotians, about 1,130, one of them actually ended up landing in Freetown. But the liberated Africans came, there were almost 100,000 of them who landed in Freetown between 1808 and 1863. So I'm going to stop there now, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gaba, and thanks to all three of our speakers. The one common theme that has run through all of these talks this morning is the diversity of the city, and in particular, as Dr. Rashid pointed out at the beginning, the contentious nature of the history, which flies in the face of this notion of Freetown being this melting pot. And you can understand the contention in that history because of the different types of people who came and how they managed to forge this city in the end. Sometimes it's a miracle that this city is still surviving and vibrant when you consider the history from the very beginning of its establishment. The Nova Scotians were fighting with the Sierra Leone Company for their rights, and then the Maroons that came on were used to help quell the rebellion by the Nova Scotians, and that made for tenuous relationships between those groups. And then you added on the liberated Africans who joined them from all parts of the West and Central African coast, and they brought their own cultures, and trying to meld all of those people together into one city was quite a feat. So thank you all. Thanks to all the presenters. We have a couple questions already in the chat, and I will go to those questions now and take as many as time will allow. The first question was for Dr. Rashid. What role would you say history could play in focusing the priorities of Freetown's evolving identity? how would knowing where we come from influence our approach to addressing challenges of modern economics, climate, technology, and so on? That's a loaded question.
Okay, so I spent last week in the British archives looking at various documents. One of the documents I looked at, which is a very interesting and contentious document, was the crafting and passing of the Freetown City Council legislation, the municipal legislation that started in the 1940s and I think was completed immediately after the war. There was a lot of arguments on different sides of how that legislation would look like. And it was nice to see a document that was a document of the Accra City Council, which was exactly what the Freetown City Council ordinance was based on, with a lot of reduction and a lot of adjustment. Why am I raising this? I'm raising this in response to the questions because of two things. So one, as you said, is that it's important for us to know the history of the city so that we get a sense of a city which really we're all aware of, and our colleague Melbourne has pointed out, started precariously. So Granville town, which was the original town, failed. And they had to reconstitute and start the city, which is now Freetown, in 1792. And that city grew in very complex and fragmented ways, because the liberated Africans who came, not all of them were immediately located in the city. They were located on the periphery of the city. Today, we have a city in Freetown where that original settlement, the settlement by the liberated Africans, the other settlement by African groups, which had existed and coexisted with the founding of the settlement, have over time come to merge. And as those settlements merge, so have been the people coming in and out. Just a quick joke. Yesterday, I was asking with the march pass, I said, so where the Lebanese and Indian people there? They say not to ethnic group now, Salon. It's a funny joke, but it's a serious question, because we have in Sierra Leone a city which is not in the old colonial sense, quote unquote, a native African city, but a cosmopolitan city where people from different parts of not only Sierra Leone, West Africa, but also in different parts of the world have come to make their own. Not to recognize that would let us miss where the city is, as I said, in terms of its cosmopolitanism. So that's responding to the first question about identity. So if we understand our city as immensely complicated, as a city where you don't only have the people who now identify as Creole, who were part of the core of the making of that settlement, whose imprints in different parts of the city, but also the people over time that have come to share and make the city with them, who would miss where the city is. 2 days ago, was it 2 or 3 days ago, when the mayor was making her opening remarks, she talked about something that was very interesting, and that connects me to the ordinance. She said that the present ordinance under which the city operates now is a local government ordinance whose provisions are the same for Port Loko, for Makeni, for Bo, for other cities which are much more smaller, less diverse, and less of the challenges than Freetown. So when somebody asks, how do we move forward? And here I'm going to be political. I'm going to be political because you cannot run and you cannot manage Freetown under the current local government ordinance. Freetown needs its own municipality ordinance because it's a much more complex city, and Freetown is not Sierra Leone, but Freetown embodies the spirit of Sierra Leone in such a way in which no other city in that country probably does. And we have to accept that, and we have to find, and we have to put not only the legislative tools, but also the structure for Freetown to be governed and to be run as a modern cosmopolitan city, which are facing the challenges. That's my response to the question.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid, for that passionate response. There was one more question, but apparently it seems like we are out of time now because there's another panel that's about to start. And so I want to, at this point, thank all the speakers for this first panel. Thank you very much for your enlightening reflections. And my apologies for not being able to get to all the questions that were submitted. Over to you, Mr. Labor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rashid, thank you, Dr. Blyden, and thank you very much, Mr Gaba. And thank you, Dr. Sylvia King. We also have among us Dr. Afua Cooper, who is also slated to make a presentation. We just to keep our time going, we would make an adjustment, and we have a session. We have a session just after the mayor's speech, in which she'll be presenting her materials to us. So we'll, Dr. Cooper, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll be able to deliver your contributions after the mayor's speech.